Hi there, and welcome to the overall Period 3 review covering the years of 1754 to 1800 for APUS history. I'm your APUSH Lady Boss, and go ahead and click down in the description to grab some guided notes to follow along as you watch this video. So what we are discussing here today in this video is how important is the period? What are the topics and key concepts? That's the heart of the video. We're going to look at the main skill, a review of the important terms, some key themes, and then the learning objectives. I'll discuss how you should use those last three things as part of your study plan. So the first two things here, exam weighting and recommended class periods, that's something that teachers should be aware of. And when you are preparing for your final AP exam that you'll take in the spring, you want to know that this is the equivalent of 10 to 17% of the total AP exam. You absolutely will have multiple choice that cover this unit, and most likely it's going to be a short answer question. It can be included in questions 1 and 2 and also the optional question 3. It might be in the DBQ. So the DBQ can cover the years of 1754 to 1980. So it may or may not be covered there. And then the LEQ, it could be included in the optional question 1. So remember, for the LEQ, you're going to get 3 options, and these years would be covered in the first question. So in this unit, there are 13 lessons, 11 of which cover content. The first and the last are more skill-based. So our first concept for this unit is that British attempts to assert tighter control over its North American colonies and the colonial resolve to pursue self-government led to a colonial independence movement and the Revolutionary War. So we're talking about the tighter control, the stricter enforcement of economic policies, and how that led to the independence movement. So to start, we want to contextualize. This is the skill where we look at the broad ideas, the developments, the processes that are happening in the time period and how that affects the content of the unit. So I like to look at this as far as social, political, and economic circumstances. So you want to remember that religion and the Great Awakening are having a major impact in North America at this time. People are becoming more religious in the sense of they are having a more personal connection in their religious behavior, and it's allowing them to question the leadership of their churches. We have a very rapidly growing young population in the British colonies, and it is still primarily rural and agricultural. Politically, the Enlightenment is a major factor. So the ideas of natural rights, social contract or compact, the idea that the government should be replaced if it is not protecting the natural rights, those are all ideas that fuel the Revolutionary War. Also at this time, there's lots of boundary issues. We're having conflict over boundaries with other nations. And then our colonial assemblies are really important in the revolutionary movement, as they are the ones that end up forming the congresses that run the country during the Revolutionary War. Economics. We have mercantilism and salutary neglect from last unit. So this is the economic policy that Britain enforced, or actually did not enforce. But if you remember the Navigation Acts, there were these rules that were to govern the trade between North America and other countries, but they neglected to really enforce them. And that shifts after the French and Indian War. We have significant differences between our 4 colonial regions, which leads to different attitudes in the Revolutionary War, different economic motivations. And we also have labor systems that are continuing on in this period. Indentured servitude has waned significantly and slavery is growing. So those are some of the ideas and developments that are happening in the time period. But let's look more closely at our first content video, which is the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. So really for this one, you want to be aware of the causes and effects. So the primary cause is going to be rivalry between Britain and France, and specifically rivalry over the fur trade in the Ohio River Valley. Effects. After the war ends, Britain is going to win. If you remember, this is the war between Britain and France and their American Indian allies. So the Treaty of Paris is going to end the war, and it's going to end the French control of the region. And so we see the expansion of the British Empire up to the Mississippi River. This is going to lead to significant debt for Britain. And so then Britain is going to need to increase revenue. They are going to do this through taxes. And then after the war ends, we see colonists moving past the Appalachian Mountains, since now that territory they consider to be part of Britain's empire, which leads to Pontiac's Rebellion. This is going to be a significant American Indian war. And what happens is Britain is going to respond after this with the Proclamation of 1763, which prevents colonial expansion past the Appalachian Mountains. So we're starting to see some changes in the relationship between Britain and the North American colonies. So here you can see the map of the most significant effect of the French and Indian War, territorial expansion for the British Empire. So let's go through taxation without representation. This is a pretty intense video if you're following along with my curriculum. And there's a lot of British actions and colonial responses. And my students always ask me, do I have to memorize all of these? And the answer is no, but you really should be familiar with some specific causes and effects. So understanding that our initial acts by Britain, the Sugar and Stamp Acts, the Townshend Acts, those lead to the organization of colonial protest movements. So we see the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, the Stamp Act Congress, we see protests. So these initial acts by Britain lead to increased organization within the colonies to protest those actions. We see the military increasing in presence as a result of these protest movements, which lead to the Boston Massacre. We see acts later, like the Tea Act and the Intolerable Acts, leading to even larger organizations and protests, like the Boston Tea Party and the First Continental Congress. And we see, as a result of the First Continental Congress, the decision to actually begin to train troops. And then, of course, we have the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord, leading to the Declaration of Independence. So you don't need to know this entire thing, but I would understand the trajectory, how the intensity increases over time, but it is a gradual increase in those tensions between the British and the North American colonies. So then the next lesson is the American Revolution. And the main thing that you want to be aware of for this is going to be the factors contributing to victory. So the College Board states what these 4 factors are. You need to be aware of the actions of the colonial militias and the Continental Army. So being aware of things like the Battle of Saratoga and the Battle of Yorktown, those are the 2 that I teach the most. George Washington's leadership, understanding kind of who he was as a person and how that fueled the Revolutionary War, the cause of the war. The ideological commitment and resilience, focusing on how colonists were resilient in the face of massive challenges and continued on despite those struggles. And the assistance of European allies, especially the Franco-American alliance. Those are going to be the main things you should be aware of. Other things, other information that you should also know is the advantages and disadvantages and the strategies. So how the American colonies were trying to have a war of attrition, how they were trying to defend the territory, whereas Britain had to go on the offensive. Understanding the role of women and American and African Americans is important as well for understanding how the Revolutionary War ideals ended up impacting them. And then the impact of the Treaty of Paris, which granted independence to the United States. So there's the American Revolution. And again, probably one of the most significant things as a result of the treaty will be the boundary changes that happen. As you can see now, in 1783, the United States exists. So what are the must-knows from Key Concept 3.1? What led to the change in the relationship between Britain and the American colonies? So focusing on the French and Indian War, how was that a turning point in that relationship? How did Britain attempt to assert increased control? So why did mercantilism and salutary neglect end? And what are some examples of actions they took to increase control? How did the colonies respond to the end of salutary neglect? So having some examples of protest movements, organizations, writings, those types of things. And what allowed for the American colonies to emerge victorious? You want to make sure you remember those 4 factors that led to the victory of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War. So now moving ahead to Key Concept 3.2. The American Revolution's democratic and republican ideals inspired new experiments with different forms of government. So this is a very political-based key concept here. So the first topic related to this key concept is the philosophical foundations of the American Revolution. So once again, emphasizing the importance of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, how it led to regular people believing they had certain rights and that the government was supposed to protect those rights and that it was okay for them to criticize their authorities. And there are some specific people and works that you should be familiar with. John Locke isn't specifically mentioned in the curriculum. However, knowing at least one Enlightenment figure is a good idea. Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence, those are mentioned explicitly. So you have to know these documents and these people so that you can explain how their ideas convinced people that it was common sense to declare independence, that Britain had lost their right to rule due to these various reasons, due to these grievances. So next we have the influence of revolutionary ideals. So during and after the war, what impact did these ideals make on society? So first, looking at domestic impact. Well, for African Americans, it did increase calls for abolition. And so we see some states in their constitution banning and abolishing slavery. But other states are actually going to gradually emancipate slaves. And so they're going to set a timeline and a process in which slavery will phase out. And then, of course, in our southern states, slavery does not get abolished. In fact, it increases rapidly. For women, we see the ideas of the revolution impacting them with the emergence of Republican motherhood. This is the idea that women play a really important role in the Republic, and their role is to educate their sons to be proper citizens of America, to be the future leaders of America. And if women are going to be able to educate their sons, they also have to have an education. And so this affects women, especially in the New England, northern areas, because women are going to have greater access to education here. We also see a greater participation in government as a result of the revolutionary ideals. For example, removal of church membership as a requirement for voting is one of the things that happens. So there you have your Republican motherhood image, women educating their children. Okay, global impact. We see future independence movements kind of using the same language of the American Revolution and of the Enlightenment. So the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, rebellions in Latin America or independence movements there, all were fueled in part by the language of the American Revolution. And so while the American Revolution took the ideas from the Enlightenment, those other revolutions will do the same. And so we see these ideas having a broad impact around the world. Next up, related to the topic, is the Articles of Confederation. And really the key to remember here with the Articles of Confederation is that they were intentionally creating a weak federal government to prevent tyranny. They did not give power to the central government out of fear that it would turn into a tyranny like Britain and Parliament had acted towards the colonies. And so when you look at the list of federal powers, you will see that most of those powers are related to war. They are able to declare war, make treaties, regulate armed services, but they cannot do things like levy taxes. They can request money, but they cannot levy taxes. States have really the important powers when not in a war. They are going to regulate commerce, administer justice. Those things that are essential are going to be left to the power of the states. And so successes of the Articles is they do play an important role in the Revolutionary War, helping to organize the nation and organize the military. Also, after the war is over, they convinced states that had claimed Western lands to cede them to the federal government, so then the federal government could sell them and make money that way. They also pass a series of ordinances that create the process for other territories to become states, and also a division of the land and dedicating an area specifically for public education. Failures, however, are going to be many financial failures, inability to pay back war debts, foreign and domestic, is going to lead to significant problems that would lead to calls for revisions to the articles. And that leads us, this is Shays Rebellion here, a major rebellion over the financial issues. So this leads us to the Constitutional Convention and debates over ratification. So delegates are going to meet in Philadelphia here, all states but Rhode Island, and they are going to come up with a series of compromises. One of the most important is going to be the Great Compromise. This is dealing with congressional representation. So New Jersey had proposed a plan of equal representation. So every state would have the same number of representatives. However, Virginia, a larger state, wanted population to be proportional based on population. And so what they decided was the Great Compromise proposed by Connecticut, where we would have a bicameral legislature, where we would have the House of Representatives with proportional representation and the Senate with equal representation. And in order for a bill to become a law, it has to pass through both houses. Another compromise that you need to be aware of is the 3/5 compromise. This is once again dealing with representation. And it was about the idea of how much slaves would count towards the population, which would then impact the representation. And so they decided that an enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person for representation in the federal government. They also determined that the federal government will make no laws regarding the slave trade until 1808. So there are many other compromises, which we'll talk about next, but what ends up happening in the ratification is we see two groups coming forward. The Federalists, who are in favor of the ratification of the Constitution, and they write a series of Federalist papers explaining the aspects of the Constitution so that people will be their fears will be alleviated about this new, more powerful federal government. But anti-federalists are opposed to the ratification of the Constitution because they feel it gives too much power to the federal government. And so they insist that a Bill of Rights must be added in order for them to vote for ratification. And so their role is really essential in this process of guaranteeing individual rights and liberties. So the Constitutional Convention has, the Constitution has many aspects and principles, but there are 4 that are really specifically mentioned in the APUSH curriculum. The first is federalism, and this is the distribution of powers between federal and states governments. Now, federalism did exist under the Articles. However, the powers were much more were delegated in a much higher percentage to the state governments. And so here we see a better balance of power with more powers going to the federal government. Separation of powers is going to refer to the fact that the federal government is not made up of just one person or one group, but actually there are 3 branches of government and there are different groups within each branch. And then checks and balances is the system that is developed that doesn't allow for any branch to take too much power. It gives power to the other branches to oversee and regulate the powers in the other branches. And then the final aspect of the Constitution you want to be really familiar with is the amendments, specifically the Bill of Rights. And so the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments guaranteeing freedoms and protections for individual rights. And there have been 17 additional amendments beyond that, and you will learn of a few more throughout the year. All right, another concept related to Key Concept 3.2 is going to be the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. And so one of the major things that we see happening is that these 2 presidents are really setting the precedents for the nation. And so there's no other decisions they can look back on and base their decisions on. They are making decisions that future presidents will look back on and make adjustments or follow. We also see the development of political parties. So you need to be very aware of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. You should be really familiar with the fact that Federalists wanted a stronger federal government. They believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and they are going to support the ideas of Hamilton's financial plan. They're going to be much stronger in the New England area and urban areas. Democratic Republicans, however, are going to really emphasize the role of the rural Americans, the farmers, and they strongly believe in a strict interpretation protecting states' rights. And so they are going to come to odds with each other in Washington's presidency and then throughout the next few decades. Hamilton's financial plan is another thing you should be aware of. As we mentioned under the Articles of Confederation, there was major financial issues. So Hamilton's financial plan is this idea to deal with these issues. George Washington's farewell address is essential. It's mentioned explicitly, and so you need to be familiar with the idea that he tried to warn against factions and political parties within the nation, and he also warned against permanent alliances with other nations. Under John Adams, you should be familiar with the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made becoming a citizen more difficult. It made deporting immigrants easier, and it prevented the expression of criticism against the government. And so we see some opposition to that as the First Amendment uses the basis for that opposition. All right, another concept related to 3.2 is the development of an American identity. So looking at how we start to see a national culture developing, we can see this reflected through art, literature, and architecture. We see that there are some ideas such as nationalism. We see women taking a stronger role in American literature. And we also still have regional variations. So differences over the ideas of slavery and the roles of women and differences between urban and rural culture. And so we can't say that there's one singular American identity, but we do know that there are some values that are important to Americans, and those end up starting to be reflected in some of our more popular aspects of life. So must-knows from Key Concept 3.2. What ideas influenced the American Revolution? And then how did those ideas impact other revolutions? How did America's first political experiment fail? Specifically thinking about the Articles of Confederation here. And then you want to be able to compare the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. What aspects began to develop of an American identity, and how did political ideas, institutions, and systems develop? So really looking at those first two presidents. All right, our last key concept is shorter. We've got key concept 3.3, migration within North America and competition over resources, boundaries, and trade, intensified conflicts among peoples and nations. So in shaping a new republic, we have 4 groups of people that the nation has challenges with. With Britain, they are failing to enforce the Treaty of Paris, and so Britain has not left its outposts. This leads to Jay's Treaty, which doesn't really solve the issues. Britain is also impressing our ships and our sailors, and so Jay's Treaty doesn't really solve that issue, but it is a diplomatic attempt at that. Spain, on the other hand, we're having conflicts over commerce and land, specifically dealing with the Port of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. Now, Spain sees the treaty with Jay's Treaty and is pushed to then not get excluded from North America, and is convinced to pass or agree to Pinckney's Treaty, which gives the United States the right to use the Mississippi River and the port. France, there's major conflict with the French Revolution, and the U.S. is divided over whether to intervene or not, and Washington chooses to stay neutral in this revolution. The XYZ affair happens during John Adams' presidency and is an embarrassment in some ways, as American diplomats were asked to pay a bribe and they refuse, and it leads to an undeclared war with France that goes into Jefferson's presidency. With American Indians, there's an ambiguous relationship over what happens after the Revolutionary War, and major conflicts over land and treaties. One to be familiar with would be the Treaty of Greenville. So here is an example of the British impressing Americans. So movement in the early republic, as I just mentioned, the Treaty of Greenville, as Americans move into territory controlled by American Indians, we see shifting alliances, we see conflict over land and resources, and the Treaty of Greenville really demonstrates how the United States goes to conflict, and when they win, they push American Indians further west. Frontier culture is a really interesting concept, looking at how people who lived in this area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River developed a unique attitude about life and often felt separate from Americans that were involved in the Revolution. For slavery, we see the growth of slavery through the Deep South, as well as increased anti-slavery sentiments in the North. And so we see those regional attitudes developing from the outset of the nation. So what do you need to know about concept 3.3? How did conflict in North America intensify after the Revolutionary War? And how did the U.S. deal with challenges to its borders and trade? And what was the impact of westward migration? All right, the skill for this unit is on continuity and change. So what is remaining, what is staying the same, and what is changing? And so some examples are American identity. Thinking about how at the beginning of the unit, there wasn't an American identity. They were British. And by the end, we have a lot of ideas of national identity as well as regional variations. You want to think about how the relationship between Britain and the American colonies changed through this time. And then forms of government. There are significant changes and also some continuities, things that stay the same through the Articles and the Constitution. So some key dates to be aware of: the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris, the Constitutional Convention, and the Peaceful Revolution, the shift of power from Federalists to Democratic Republicans in 1800. So these can be some signposts, if you will, some areas that you should really keep in your mind as key parts of this unit. So when you're studying, you want to be really familiar with the most important vocabulary words that the College Board is emphasizing. And here's the list from this unit. I have a playlist you can check out with each video being 2 to 5 minutes on each of these terms. So check that out if you need a better review of these specific pieces of evidence that will be essential for understanding this unit. Key themes. You can look at these themes. Often these are going to be the themes of your essays, your prompts and your short answer questions, your document-based question, or your long essay questions. So thinking about national identity, migration, politics, America in the world, regional culture, social structures. Those are the main themes that are covered in Unit 3. And then finally, this is a really good strategy for reviewing for your test. It's to look at the learning objectives. The College Board tells you what they want you to know. They want you to explain the causes and effects of the 7 Years' War. So write those out. Create a T-chart, causes, effects. Go through each of these. And if you feel like you can't answer it, go back to one of my videos and it will describe to you exactly what you need to know related to these key concepts. So that was a lot. If you are still with me, thanks for hanging in there. I hope this was helpful for you in understanding period 3. And if so, please like and subscribe.